Hi, my name is Jason T. Ingram. I'm a multimedia artist and mental health activist. I go by the artist name of Fake Zappa, and I'm here in my new trailer. And I had a motorhome last year. I called it the Mobile Man Cave. I haven't titled this one yet, but I'm thinking of calling it Destination Unknown. And I'm excited. There's a lot of new things going on in my life, and there's also a lot of things that have really been inside of me that I need to communicate. And this particular episode of talking about my life is going to be pretty graphic. I'm going to go into some stuff into my past, and it might be triggering, so it's kind of a trigger alert for some folks. And even some of my artwork I'm doing is kind of triggering and stuff. So I also wanted to talk about pecking order. And something else about my life is it's a good demonstration of what it's like to be in somewhere in the pecking order and at the bottom of it, and moving back and forth and sort of looking back at how I'm treated. And try not to really freak out about it, but there's times when it gets to be to the point when you just really have to speak out. You just can't handle being at the bottom of a system that doesn't work for everybody. So I'm talking to folks that have a clinical understanding of mental health, and I know a lot of people like that. And there are things that they say. There are things that the government says to educational institutions, that says to healthcare institutions, that says to the government, that says to people that are working and training in these institutions. And very little of it, or most of it, or some of it, has to do with the reality of what disabled people, especially in this context, mentally disabled people, really go through. And especially those who are at the bottom of a social pecking order, or those that don't qualify for whatever it is, that are falling through the cracks of the system, that are either overqualified and or underqualified for receiving care. Overqualification is interesting because maybe if you're getting $950 a month, which in urban West Coast you really can't survive on. It sounds like a lot of money, but these days it's not. That also disqualifies you from getting a lot of help, and that means you've got co-pays that you can't afford in order to get psychotherapy and even med management. And so that's a luxury for a lot of mentally disabled people. And then there's folks who are underqualified, and that's another thing too. So here is a lot of myths, and that's like one type of person I think that might listen to this. And the other type of person is folks in my situation who are angry and fed up and tired and need someone to relate to say, wow, I thought that was only me that went through that. And so many videos I see on YouTube about mental illness, especially mood disorders, it's not very male-centric, and my speaking out is very male-centric, just because that happens to be my gender, but it also happens to be a gender that the mental health community is doing more to reach out to and failing miserably at it. And I see that because of violent crime. And us guys are more prone to committing violent crime as a result of not getting access to mental health care, getting legitimate mental health care which is adequate and affordable. And so the whole myth of, and I call it a myth, which is go get help, sending somebody somewhere, or not even sending them somewhere, just telling them to go somewhere, calling a number, whatever it is, and just expecting that they're going to qualify to actually get the help that they need. And that's a myth. It wasn't so much 20, 30 years ago when I started getting care, and I have another video where I talk about the good old days that I remember when they'd actually pick you up and take you somewhere, and they would make sure that you get follow-up care and you weren't billed for it if you couldn't afford it. I mean, wow, wouldn't that be amazing if that happened today? And I think there's probably still some places around the country, and I'm sure places around the world that do that. But there's a lot of myths, and when I talk to folks who can't relate to what it's like in my situation, they've already made up their mind that obviously I'm not doing enough to either take care of myself, or I'm not doing enough to get the care that's available to me. And if they've already made up their mind that that's somehow my problem, then when I tell them the reality of, well, I was denied care help here, here and there, and I called this place, and I spent hours and weeks trying to call this, and it's like they get this glazed over look on their face, like, it doesn't compute, does not compute, like I just can't get through to people who think that the whole mental health thing is more healthy than it really is. And so on that note, I will say that this new therapist that I started with is actually pretty darn good and does accept my insurance, although it was pretty intimidating, all the legal bullshit that they do to protect themselves. And I didn't like the response of like, hey, this is the little bit here that really has to do with what I need. And maybe there's a little bit of stuff about HIPAA that protects me in most circumstances, but it only has to do with privacy and really nothing else. So everything else, I go in there and I'm like, I don't feel protected, I don't feel safe. And here's something for free, is that, and I've said this before, is that when men lose control and when men are prone to commit violent acts, is making them feel safe instead of controlling them just might be the solution. So try it sometime. If you see a guy who's losing control and he scares you because he's scared. That's obvious. It's like a barking dog. And there's a tendency for people that are higher up on the pecking order, and I mean people that are heard and people that aren't heard, is sort of one way to talk about pecking order. And here in urban, progressive, educated West Coast, you raise your voice, they don't listen to you. Now, when I was out in Kentucky, if they're not listening to you and you're in a Costco or something and you raise your voice, then the manager comes out and he goes, oh, wow, this guy's really serious. We better listen to him. Now, that's not the case in a lot of places around the world. Here, they always got one finger ready to call 911 if they think you even might lose control of your temper. If you're not even yelling, but you exhibit a heightened mood or something like that, then people have these reactions. And here's the thing, is that if they're in a place of authority where they're heard and they feel safe, typically, and this is the sad part too, is I call them opportunists, is that they're so used to being in their place in the pecking order, they feel safe there, and they have to remain in that place. And in order to do that, they get sort of addicted to it, although there are folks that are really, really addicted to power, and those are definitely opportunists. When somebody loses control, you have a power addict who's an opportunist, and they will push your buttons and push your buttons just to get you to lose control in order for them to do whatever the fuck they want to you. And that's a scary place to be, because you're dealing with a trauma victim who is suffering, and as a result of that is being abused by somebody in authority. And that authority figure wins every single time. And the person that loses control loses the conflict. Typically ends up being punished somehow, whether it's in the system or whether they even go to prison. And prison is full of people that have been victimized in those situations, that were traumatized, and a situation was handled very poorly because either somebody reacted in fear, abused their power, or they were opportunists that were seeking out those types of things in order for them to basically be a control freak. And so, what was I talking about? I was going to talk about my self-care and kind of brag about that a little bit. Here's a journal that I started, and I love this journal. I got it at my favorite store, Walmart. And it says, follow your dreams. I went to the health food store today and was talking about Walmart. I love to see their reactions. When I go, I bought these shopping bags at Walmart. When he said, thank you for bringing shopping bags. And so I talk about everything from dreams that I have. And if I don't feel like writing down my dreams, then I just do a summary where I do like a couple sentences of my dream, and sometimes I don't even elaborate on it, and sometimes I do. And then I write about my days sometimes, or I write about maybe prayers that I've prayed. This particular one is because I'm into some... I was raised a Unitarian, and I'm kind of back into that shit where it's like, you know, sort of a mixed bag of all kinds of different religions. So I like Native American stuff. In fact, over this last month, I've had access to a couple of Native communities and their music and dance, and it reaches me. And then I also listen to gospel music because that reaches me too. That's another part of my past. So I did some art. And here's kind of a chief that is crying, and his tears turn into horses, and I just think about it as like my pain turns into my power, and here it is turning into the sunshine. I think this one's done. I don't know if I've titled it yet. And then here's another one here, and I think I want to title this here, because he's got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 arrows in this poor cowboy going through town, and all the doors have X's on them. The church, the hospital, the everywhere doesn't let him in. And I think the title of this one, I want it to be a 6 arrow minimum, please. Like, he's not qualified because he's only been hit with 5 arrows, and we're not going to let him in. Here's one I'm working on. I was listening to Lightning Flash by the 2nd chapter of Acts, and I was thinking about this kind of lion man thing. I'm going to put shackles on him, I think, and it's just sort of this, you know, being struck with rage. And there was a big hailstorm a couple days ago, and I've got this really tough cat, and the cat even got scared, and of course the dogs got scared and everything, and so other stuff is there's a peer-to-peer helpline that I call, and movement meditation, and you know, this trend of mindfulness stuff. There's a lot of good stuff about it. I think if people learn too much about mindfulness and, you know, learning about compassion, then they can end up thinking that they're doing it because they learn so much about it, but they're not practicing it. And so if you learn too much about something, it starts fucking with your head, making you think that you're practicing the thing that you're learning, and in fact you're just learning about it. And I've noticed that with spiritual communities too, is that people are there for years and years and sometimes decades, and they're just not practicing what they preach, which is very true with most spiritual communities. But when you're at the bottom of a pecking order, it makes it so you can see above what people are doing. And I like to talk about it this way, though. When you see pictures that little kids draw, where they draw, you know, adults typically have nostrils. You know, you can't see my nostrils because you're looking at, you know, little kids are looking up. And so that's one of the reasons why pictures of adults drawn by little kids, you can see their nostrils, because that's all little kids see is they look up and see nostrils. And the way I like to look at it is, if I'm looking up at people, I can see what's inside of them. And here's another thing too, is that the higher you are on the pecking order, that's all you see is the abuse coming to you from further above, because no matter how high you get on the pecking order, unless you are the ruler of the entire world, There will always be people looking down on you, and that feels like abuse. It feels unsafe, and it's what your mind will focus on. And if you're not careful, that's all you'll see is everybody's above me, nobody's below me. So what I try to do is I try to spend time around homeless people. I'm not really good at helping them. I have a tendency to get caught up in their lives, and it's really intense, and it gets on me, and it's really, really difficult. But when I do hang out with homeless people, which has been since I was a teenager, on and off, just here and there, and especially in my neighborhood, is I just like to remind myself that I am not at the bottom of society. Although it feels like it, because I see higher functioning people with a lot of privileges that I don't have, and I feel stuck in a place where I'm not allowed to fulfill what I need to do in my life, and I'm not even allowed to contribute, even for free, the things that are gifted to me that could really help people. And it's this big fight, it's a big competition, and it shouldn't be that way. But unfortunately, if I'm going to fulfill what I'm supposed to do on earth, if folks are taking that opportunity from me and taking way more attention than they deserve, then sometimes the only thing you can do is fight, and you have to fight with peace. You don't necessarily fight with aggression. And in order to fight peacefully, you have to be creative. And luckily, artists should be creative. And so that's been my big dilemma, is how do I get to a place where there's people that have a lot of influence, and they might not even deserve that influence, but they got it somehow, whether they stole it or whether they're lucky or whether they're in the right family or whatever it is. And they're scared that other people will get that influence and take that attention away from them. And I've seen that. It's called the entertainment industry. There's a lot of untalented people that are very powerful, that are very scared of folks that are naturally gifted, and people that are really fucked up, especially abuse victims. And I'll get to that a bit, unless my camera conks out in a few minutes. But pecking order comes from, chickens and birds and stuff that peck each other. And there's one bird that pecks everybody, and then there's one bird at the bottom of the pecking order that gets pecked. And there was a demonstration of that when I was doing improv drama. And I tell you, you want to get around a pecking order, you get around theater people. Oh my God. It's really funny the way they sabotage each other verbally in ways that sound so nice. But the energy, if you kind of put out your psychic feelers, it's this conflict that's really intense. And so not only being around theater people, but doing an improv drama comedy demonstration of pecking order. There was 10 people, and we were all given a number. And 10 had a roll of newspaper and could bop it on the heads of all 9 of us. And then 9 could bop it on the heads of the other 8, and so on and so on. Well, guess who got to be number 1? It was me. I could not peck anybody. I had no pecker. And here's what happened. Here I'm a 14-year-old, and that was a tough time in my life. I was incredibly insecure, and I ran off stage just terrified, and nobody dealt with it. Nobody said, oh, why did that affect you so much to where you ran out of class? Nobody ever dealt with that. But the fact is that I felt like that at home. I felt like that with my community, even my friends, because they were in stuff like, debate teams. And there was something called junior achievement, which we called it junior capitalist, which was which was these high-functioning, powerful teens doing these things, and, that I really did not have the functioning level to do even at that age. And they've done demonstrations like this. There was a PBS documentary about social status in some kind of Nova episode about psychology and sociology or something like that. But here's the thing, is that the participants did not know their own number. So I was walking around with number 1, and I knew that, but this was a demonstration where if somebody has a 10, they don't know they're a 10 until they get a feel of how others treat them. And that was an interesting demonstration. They did it on college students, and I tell you, it's I wish they would do that demonstration on people other than college students, because it would be way more of a reality check. Because people in the education world, they already have a lot of status if they're working on a college degree. So I find that ironic. But here's what I'm trying to talk about, and I have just a few minutes left here, when it comes to trauma and being an abuse victim, especially the fact that a lot of the real heavy traumatic abuse that I suffered happened before the age of 3. And that was also a time in my life when there was a story being told about my life that would try to destroy my entire life, that would try to destroy the way others see me and the way I see myself. And it's basically comes from one word, and that word is unwanted. And when parents have an unwanted pregnancy, especially, I call myself an abortion dodger. I don't know these stories because I don't talk to my family a lot. There's a lot of taboos that I don't feel safe talking about, but occasionally there's things mentioned, and then maybe 10 years later the story comes out in a totally different way, so it's really hard to tell. But as far as I could tell, is that I was an accident, and I found that out in a very bad way one time. And then considering an abortion, which in 1973, which is when, yay, I mean, here it is, late September of 73, it was legal at that point, just newly legal as far as I know. I know that year it did. And it didn't stop there, though. There was a theme, a common reoccurring theme of the way I was treated, of being unwanted and being ignored and suffering and not getting my needs met and unable to fulfill my dreams and desires and the things that give me a reason to live. And this happened, 45 years ago, more than that. And so we're talking about carrying this stuff around. And there's been times in my life where I've actually been considered important by some people. And so here it is, this very needy, vulnerable 2-year-old whose dad was kind of slowly disappearing, and whose mom was working and drinking and working and drinking, and not having that nurturing. And then there's a man at a daycare or something like that who takes advantage of a kid in that vulnerable place, and the rest is history. And another side note too is that when it comes to especially gay men that have a background of suffering sexual trauma in early childhood, is my theory is that, one, it doesn't make a kid gay. I think it can make a straight kid want to consider doing gay stuff, because that's kind of what they were wired and accustomed to as a kid, and they can deal with that and work through that. But I think that there's something, for lack of a better term, gaydar, which is kind of like, when somebody says, I think that guy's gay. Like today, my partner, we were at the supermarket, and my partner points to this guy who's got his, anyways, he was just, I don't have very good gaydar, but he does. And he's like, I bet you that guy's family. But I think sexual predators with young boys have a sort of gaydar that they could tell this kid is some kind of sexual minority when he grows up, or he's very needy or whatever, and takes advantage of that. And so that's my theory. That was just a little side note there. And so what happens, this is the story that a lot of people have, is that their whole identity is founded upon a core belief. And the core belief in my life was unwanted, was I'm not heard, I'm not seen, no matter if I'm bleeding. Here's a graphic example. I suffered nosebleeds when I was like 5 years old, and I would cry and cry myself to sleep, and then I would rub my face on the wall so there'd be blood on the wall, and when I'd come home from school, somebody cleaned up the blood on the wall. And that was kind of an example of I'm literally bleeding, I'm crying, and suddenly somebody wipes it clean. Like it never happened. We don't talk about that. No, not in our family. That doesn't happen, because in our family, we're experts of psychology. We help people with trauma. We don't create trauma. And so I was contradicting that story. And so the story of my life, and I've been speaking this over myself, but it's really powerful, like this cognitive therapy or whatever, cognitive behavioral therapy, telling yourself the truth, is just saying, hey, this is my story, is that I'm heard. I have something to contribute with my activism, my creative stuff, not necessarily my drawings, but I mean, I've done some pretty good compositions over the years that I think shouldn't be ignored, based on what I've heard from people overseas that actually like my stuff and that encourage me. And so it's like, hey, there's something wrong here. This thing in my life that was handed to me from birth, that was telling me it doesn't matter what I succeed in, what I accomplish, and how much I suffer as a result, and how much I suffer from things that I need help with. What happens to me and what I say and what I do doesn't matter unless I do something negative. And that's where a lot of criminal behavior comes in. This unwanted thing breeds a lot of abusers and a lot of criminal behavior. So I've been very lucky, and I feel like I've been successful in that, at least so far. And I'm counting my blessings, really, because most people in my situation do end up in prison. And it's weird when I think about times in my life when I was a school teacher part-time, teaching band and stuff. They called me Mr. Ingram. And there was times like, here's my Bible school shirt. I actually did finish a Bible school. It wasn't academic. It was really easy to learn this stuff, but I was a missionary. And so it's really weird to have been treated like I'm somebody important, that I have something important to say and do. And then to do things that I feel like are even more important, and then to have that completely ignored, and have folks really, like, I hate to use this word, but like violently stand in my way to make sure that I don't succeed, because what if people heard me and not heard these people that think they're important because of their position. And so pecking order is such a huge thing that it's something I think about a lot, because I deal with it a lot, and I'm dealing with recent things in my life where I think about myself 15, 20 years ago when I was important. I was treated different. My calls were returned. My messages were returned. Now it's sort of like, and I've had this in in certain times in my life too, is okay, there's a list of piano players in the area and they're all popular, but Jason is at the bottom of the list because he's not popular.